All right, everybody. It's 7 o'clock, and as you know, we like to start on time, so I am here to welcome you. My name is Matt Bender. I am your Adult Program Coordinator here at the Schaumburg Township District Library. Welcome to tonight's program with Liz Christon about the history of knitting. Before we get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder that, as always, we're going to have the live transcript going. If you're not seeing it on your screen, take a look at your Zoom tools bar. That's what pops up when you open Zoom. And you should see something that says live transcript with the closed captioning symbol right above it. And you should be able to enable or disable automatic captions from there. I also wanted to remind you, coming up next week, this whole week and into next week is our 2-week Comic-Con event. We're going to have awesome stuff for everybody related to entertainment, comic books, science fiction, and otherwise. Take a look this Saturday. We are going to have our big Comic-Con event that's going to include a scavenger hunt, among other themed things around our branches and main library. And then Saturday after that is our big Star Wars Day. If you have Star Wars fans in your life, stop by the library. We have a lot going on. Check our calendar. All right. I think that's enough plugs from me. I'd like to talk about our current person, our presenter, who I could not be happier about. Let's listen and learn about the history of knitting with Liz Christon. Liz, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. There we are. All right. So just as a heads up, my program divides itself pretty neatly into 3 sections. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And then once we hit those breaks, I'll take a look at the chat or the Q&A, wherever you prefer to put them, and I'll address those questions as they come up. And I'll also have a little time at the end for questions as well. So I'm just going to give myself a quick little backstory, and then we'll move on to the good stuff. I was taught how to knit when I was 7 years old, and something about it just clicked for me. I don't think I've gone more than a few weeks without picking up a pair of needles since. My first exposure to historical knitting came when I was 11 years old, when I was gifted a reprint of the 1917 pattern book, the Mary Frances Knitting and Crochet Book by Jane Eyre Fryer. The book is half narrative, half tutorial, and describes various balls of yarn, crafting notions, dolls, and fairies coming to life to teach young Mary Frances how to knit. Here we can see the anthropomorphic knitting needles / twins knit and neck on the slide there. The patterns in the book are primarily for dolls, but it introduced me to the concept of historical knitting. I was enthralled by the thought that knitting was an ancient craft and that I could recreate objects our ancestors made using my own careful research and dedication. And I've been in love with the history of knitting ever since. The journalist and feminist Jane Cunningham Crowley, under the pen name of Jenny June, said in the introduction of her 1885 book, Knitting and Crochet, quote, "Knitting is one of the oldest forms of needlework and one of the most diversified and interesting. It covers a range as wide as the universe and older than history, including every class and degree from the princess to the peasant," unquote. While I would definitely agree with June's overall sentiment, knitting is not, in fact, older than history. There has been quite a bit of confusion regarding the origins of knitting. One issue is the similarity between knitting and nail binding. Nail binding is unlike knitting in that it is worked from the left to the right and uses a single needle with an eye. Think a kind of oversized darning needle and short lengths of yarn in order to create the interlocking fabric. As different as the processes may be, the finished fabric of nail binding looks remarkably similar to knitting. In fact, it looks so similar that for many decades, historians could not tell an object that was knit versus an object that was made by nail binding apart. Nail binding, though, is actually a very ancient technique, with the earliest known examples coming from modern-day Israel and dating from about 6500 BCE. You'll note that despite its geographic origins in the Middle East, we actually use the Danish term for the craft. This is because it wasn't until the 1970s when archaeologists studying Vikings realized that nail binding was separate from knitting, and they got to be the ones to name it. The previously believed to be first knitted garments, which is this red pair of cotton Egyptian socks that can be seen on the slide, has only very recently been properly identified as nail binding. In fact, these socks were made nearly 1,000 years before what we now know to be the earliest knitted object, which radically changed our understanding of the timeline of the origin of knitting. The true origins of knitting are shrouded in mystery. There are no ancient gods, goddesses, or legends associated with knitting. Compare this to weaving, which has the pre-dynastic Egyptian goddess Neith or the Greek goddess Athena as patrons. Textiles degrade over time and leave incomplete historical records. People often neglect to document what they consider to be mundane, everyday activities. And then you add to the mix all the confusion about what's knitting and what's nail binding. But what we can say for sure is that knitting developed in Islamic Africa sometime around the 10th century Common Era. One evidence of this, knitting is worked from the right to the left, just like the way Arabic is read. All of the earliest known examples of knitting, including these beautiful blue and white cotton socks we can see on the slide, all come from Egypt and date between the 11th and the 15th centuries. Knitting must have been around for a while before then, as these socks would have taken a great deal of skill to produce. They use stranded color work, which is a technique that requires the knitter to use different colored yarns at the same time in order to create the kind of designs we see here. They also have turned heels and shaped toes, things that are generally not recommended first projects for new knitters, and probably something they didn't just imagine out of thin air. It probably was a while to get to that kind of skill. We can also guess that knitting was a very skilled trade, as these socks have words and letters worked into the designs as good luck charms, meaning that their makers were probably literate. All known examples from this period are knit in the round and with cotton yarns. During the Middle Ages, knowledge of knitting expanded from the Middle East and into Europe. The earliest confirmed European knitted textiles come from around 1200 to 1300 Common Era. The vast majority of surviving articles from this time seem to be fashionable and/or artistic items meant for the wealthy, such as vestments for important religious figures, pillows, rugs, and other kinds of decorative items. We can guess that knitting was maybe not just a form of art, but perhaps also a kind of genteel domestic chore around the Middle Ages, as evidenced by several paintings of a knitting Virgin Mary with the child Jesus. In this circa 1400 painting by the German artist Bertram of Minden, the Madonna appears to be knitting some sort of seamless undershirt on very fine double-pointed knitting needles. Even though a few centuries have now passed since the invention of knitting, it still only appears to be done in the round. However, now objects are also being made with cottons as well as with silks, other way around, with silks as well as with cottons. Great many more artifacts from the Renaissance survive to this day. Here we can see a knitted garment that was once worn by an Italian noblewoman. This is a pair of silk stockings that belonged to the Duchess of Florence, Eleonora de Toledo, who lived from 1519 to 1562. These aging bits of hosiery actually represent two milestones in knitting history. Before this time, European stockings were usually made out of non-stretchy woven fabrics, which were cut and sewed together in an attempt to shape to the wearer's leg. Eleonora's knitted stockings would have been a great deal more elastic and much more comfortable than those earlier styles. The other innovation, these socks are the earliest known examples of lacy knitting. Not lace knitting though, there is a difference. Lace knitting has yarn overs, knit-to-togethers, those kinds of decorative stitches on every single row with no rest row. Lacy knitting has a rest row of either all knits or all purls. So this is lacy knitting, not lace knitting. Also during the 1500s, we have a major innovation in that the purl stitch appears for the first time. This means that knitting could now be worked flat or back and forth, opposed to just being in the round. It doesn't appear that people were knitting long, flat scarves or shawls, but instead that this technique was used to work short rows for heels on socks. During this time, we start to see garments being made from thicker yarns, as well as from the significantly cheaper wools and linens. We also see the first ever published knitting pattern, which was a single pattern for a lace edging in a 1524 Danish book of needlework. As we transition from the latter part of the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment era, we start to see a difference in how the English view knitting versus the rest of mainland Europe. In England, knitting was largely an everyman's activity. In mainland Europe, though, most countries, a person could only legally knit if they belonged to a guild or what was essentially a union of knitters. To show you how popular knitting was in England, during the 17th century, a law was passed that no one was allowed to knit during the harvest season, as so many men, women, and children were knitting all throughout the year that they weren't harvesting their landlord's crops. Knitting was even encouraged as a way to subdue the Scots during the Jacobite Rebellion, which I think it's a shame that Outlander never addresses like some English person coming to Scotland and forcing Jamie to learn how to knit. This is not to say that there weren't any knitting guilds in England, just that knitting was very common practice at all levels of society, and there were no laws restricting who could knit. Knitting guilds were actually quite powerful in England, and in 1571, the British Parliament passed a law that on Sundays, everyone, with the exception of, quote, maids, ladies, gentlewomen, noble personages, and every lord, knight, and gentleman of 20 marks land, as well as those who are actively traveling, must wear a, quote, cap of wool, knit, thicked, and dressed in England, made within this realm, and only dressed and finished by some of the trade of cappers, upon pain to forfeit for every day of not wearing 3 shillings 4pence, unquote. In other words, all non-land-owning men had to wear a silly floppy hat, much like the one here seen on the slide, every Sunday in order to keep the professional hat knitters, who belonged to the union called the Trade of Cappers, in order to keep them busy, or else they may have to pay a $70 fine. So England was particularly known for their different styles of hats that these different knitting guilds would create, and they were very unique and distinctive to those regions. I have made here a recreation of a Monmouth cap, which is Wales, not England, but same principle stands. So this is what the knitters in the Monmouth region were making. There's lots of examples of hats that look just like this. So this is my recreation. You can see it is very thick wool, and it's been felted, which in those days they called thicking. It was thicked. And then it also has a double knit brim to keep your ears warm, this little loop so you could take off your hat and wear it on your belt. And then a little, they called it the button at the top. It's just the last few stitches with the thread wrapped really tightly around them. So this is my recreation of a Monmouth cap. Now, if we turn to Europe, we can see that there were very strict rules required to join a knitting guild. For one, all master knitters were male. To be a master knitter and to join a guild, one had to be an apprentice for anywhere between 3 to 5 years, depending on your region. Then he had to become a journeyman and work for other masters before he could be considered a full-fledged master on his own and legally allowed to knit. They were also required to make certain elaborate objects to pass a kind of final exam. For example, in 1609, the Knitters Guild in Vienna, Austria, required that members make a, quote, table carpet in 6 colors, a beret, a pair of silk stockings, and a pair of gloves. This rug, seen here on the slide, is an actual example of a rug a master knitter had to make in order to prove his skill. This is basically somebody's doctoral dissertation or master's thesis. This is a very complicated object that they would have to make in order to prove their knitting skill and be allowed to start their own knitting business and be legally allowed to knit on their own. So as I mentioned, you had to be a man to be a master knitter. No women could be master knitters. And this was very strictly enforced. One Viennese law in 1689 said that complicated knits and repairs could not be done by a woman. So a master knitter was allowed to hire members of his family, female members of his family, to knit for him, but they were not allowed to do anything complicated. So, for example, a woman might be allowed to knit the leg of a stocking, but she would have to hand it over to a man in order to turn the heel, because that was considered too complicated for a woman to do. By the late 1700s, knitting machines became more economical than the hand knitting industry, and this slowly started to fade away in both Britain and Europe. Knitting gradually became more of a pleasure activity for the wealthy, and the powerful political guilds started to fade to the wayside. So we've reached the end of the first section of our program. Does anybody have any questions before we proceed? I'll wait a second here for somebody to type something in the chat or the Q&A. All right, I'm not seeing anything, so I'll just go ahead and keep going. So before we take a broader look at what happened to knitting during the Industrial Revolution, I'd like to quickly touch on a couple of different regional styles, as many of them developed around this time in history. This is by no means an exhaustive look of every kind of regional style of knitting. If you gave me 6 hours, I couldn't cover it all. This is just kind of like a highlights tour of the world. These are styles of knitting that I see pretty frequently, like in stores. Even ready-made clothes will be inspired by these styles. A lot of patterns on Ravelry will take inspiration from these styles. So consider this just a little bit of a best of tour. So first, we're going to look at the Kawachen Sweater. When European settlers began inhabiting modern-day South Vancouver Island in the 1850s, they introduced knitting to the Kawachen people. The Kawachen combined this new skill with their own familiar weaving techniques, such as using a very dense single-ply wool in natural colors and incorporating traditional designs of local animals like orcas or eagles. At first, the Kawachen people primarily used knitting to make blankets, but in the 1920s, the design for Kawachen sweaters was born. At the same time, sporty knitted sweaters started to become trendy. In the 1950s, Kawachen sweaters fully entered the mainstream. And if you're familiar with the dude from The Big Lebowski, he's wearing a Kawachen-inspired sweater. Next, we have Choyo hats, which are common in the South American Andes. Knitting arrived in this region with the Spanish conquistadors and quickly became very popular. The Choyo hats are beautifully colorful, often made from alpaca wools, and usually have ear flaps with tassels at the end of them. In the last 100 years or so, they have been traditionally knitted on bicycle spokes, which the knitter would sand down to a point to make them really nice and sharp. Interestingly, knitting Choyo hats was seen as a male duty, even though men and women usually knit alike in this region. And there's also an interesting style where knitters usually wrap the yarn around the back of their neck and carry the ball of yarn in a pouch at their side rather than in front of them, so that way they can knit and walk around. This is my one and only cheater for the program, I swear. This is the only thing I will be showing you that I did not make myself. I found this, it's vintage, probably from about the 1950s or so, but everything else I made, I promise. But here is an example of a vintage Choyo hat. You can see we've got this really beautiful design of children holding hands. And on the ear flaps, we have these birds, and there's some geometric designs and some more birds up there. You can see where the tassels once were. They apparently have fallen off with time. There's just sort of little dangly threads there now, but I think it's really beautiful, and I felt really lucky to get my hands on it. Erin sweaters are associated with the fishermen of the Aran Islands, located off the west coast of Ireland. There are a lot of legends about the elaborate cable patterns representing clans or telling family stories, but that doesn't actually appear to be true. Instead, fishermen likely just passed on cable patterns from village to village as they traveled and interacted with their neighbors. Erin sweaters really took off in 1891 when the Congested Districts Board, which was a government program attempting to alleviate the extreme poverty in the area, began a program to teach impoverished people in the Aran Islands, men, women, and children alike, all how to make cable sweaters for extra income. So everybody was a knitter. Everybody could understand how to make a sweater, how to make a beautiful cable. Somebody might come up with an idea for a new cable, teach it to somebody else, go to another town to sell their fish, teach it to somebody there. So that's how the knowledge of the cable pattern spread. Fair Isle sweaters come from Northern England and from Scotland. They're known for their elaborate designs. Some vintage Fair Isle have maybe 30 colors total. However, only ever 2 colors are used per row. That's one of the hallmarks of Fair Isle. Fair Isle sweaters really hit the mainstream and were even considered high fashion in the early 1920s when Edward, the Prince of Wales, wore a Fair Isle sweater while golfing. This is a portrait of the prince wearing one of his sweaters. And if you're interested in royal history, he is the one that abdicated for Wallace Simpson. I have my own vintage pattern that I used for Pharaoh Vest. This pattern's from the 1940s. It's a very simple Fair Isle. There's not a whole lot going on here. I think I used 6 colors, but you can see how only ever 2 colors are used at a time. So like here, we've got the gray, blue, and then the next row, it goes like pink, blue, and then pink, green. So you're never using like 5 colors all in one row. You're only ever using 2 colors per row. So Fair Isle can look very intimidating, but it's actually not too hard to sink your teeth into it once you get started. The Danish Faroe Islands give us the Faraway Shawls, which is knit from the rough wool of Faroe sheep. Faraway shawls may be simple, colorful, or lacy, but their hallmark is this interesting wedge shape that starts up at the nape of the wearer's neck and then flares out towards the bottom of the shawl. I can speak from experience that that kind of unusual shaping is actually very wearable and helps turn a simple plain triangle into something much more 3D that kind of curves and fits your body. I have an example of a kind of fusion of modern and traditional. This is a modern pattern for a shawl. It's done in mosaic knitting, which is very modern, but it uses the traditional Faroe shaping. So you can see here, it's kind of echoed in the design that we have that little wedge that starts at the nape of your neck and then flares out towards the bottom of the shawl. And then it's kind of like 2 triangles on either side. So it makes it a really beautiful 3D shape, and it makes it a lot more wearable. It doesn't slide off your shoulders as much as a very plain triangle would. Gansey sweaters are most commonly associated with fishermen from the English Channel Islands, which can be found off the west coast of France. Gansey sweaters are heavy wearing with fancy knit and purl design on the yoke between the shoulders. They also have this very distinctive triangle-shaped gusset that would go under the wearer's underarm, as well as having a split hem at the bottom, kind of like a men's button-up shirt would. These were intended to give the wearer a larger range of motion and then also make it easier for repair. So like that separate little diamond shape on the underarm, if it got worn out, it was knitted and sewed in separately. So it was very easy to just cut it out and make a new one. And interestingly, just like Choyo hats all the way on the other side of the world, Gansey sweaters are also traditionally knit on sharpened bicycle spokes. Hat shawls come from England and Scotland and were traditionally knit from the wool of Shetland sheep. They are enormous squares with usually a plain garter stitch center and then either colorful or lace borders that go all the way around. The plain white versions are usually associated with either weddings or christenings. Colorful ones were usually worn for every day. I have made my own little tiny version of a hat shawl. Traditional hat shawls are absolutely enormous, and you can really bundle yourself all up in one. I made just a little one to wear under my coat. But so here you can see it's just a little square. And so the center on this one, like many of traditional hat shawls, is actually knit diagonally. So you cast on like 2 or 3 stitches down at one corner, and then you increase till you're at the halfway point, and then you decrease all the way down to the other end. And then you go around and pick up all the stitches all the way around the border in order to make that lace feather and fan, or as it was traditionally called, old shale, and make that old shale design all the way around the edges. I don't want to say it was a slog to make this, because I am really happy that turned out, and I did enjoy doing it. But I also don't know if it would have been finished if I hadn't caught a really bad cold and needed to stay in bed for a couple of days. That was a couple of years ago. So, the last few rows going all the way around the shawl, you're well over 500 stitches a row. So each row took quite a while to do. Lopapesa are Icelandic sweaters with a colorful yoke knit from the single ply yarn called lopi, which is a blend of the inner and outer coats of Icelandic sheep. Like fair isle knitting, the designs may be really elaborate, but they typically only use 2 colors per row. Also, like Erin knitting, they've entered the mainstream with this tantalizing idea that the designs are really ancient and really traditional, but they are not. The first Lopapesas come from the 1950s, and they start to get really trendy in the 1970s and remain popular tourist trophies today. Lopapesa are one of my favorite traditional knitting designs to work with. I usually knit myself one every year. This is my 2021 sweater. I have not made the 2022 yet. I do have the yarn, I just haven't started yet. But you can see that wonderful traditional shaping. So they usually have this round yoke, so that way the design goes around your shoulders. Some of them may be bottom up, some of them may be top down. This is a bottom up pattern. So you knit the sleeves and the body separately, and then join it all together and knit that colorful yoke. You can see that there's a lot of color, but this one isn't quite traditional because there are a few rows where they use 3 colors, but mostly Lopapesas will use 2 colors at a time. So these are one of my favorite kinds of sweaters. All right, so we've actually reached the end of the second third of our program. So does anybody have any questions? I could take a second here. If you have any questions about regional knitting styles, and then we'll continue from like the mid 1800s up to the present day. And I'll wait a second to see if anybody has any questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. Julie says, how do you spell the Faroese for the shawl? It's Faroese. It's kind of a weird spelling. There you go. So I put that in the chat if you want to look that up yourself. Jennifer says, did most countries use the same gauge? No, there's a pretty broad variety. Historically, finer gauges, like with more stitches to the inch with thinner yarns, is more common, but that's not a universal standard. For example, like the Kawachen sweaters are knit with very, very dense, very, very thick wool, because before knitting was introduced to the area, they were weaving with very, very thick, very, very dense wool. So they just kept using that same kind of wool. Lopi sweaters are usually a little heavier. Actually, Gansey sweaters are actually much thicker yarn than you would expect. That was kind of one of their hallmarks, is that they were very, very dense and very, very hard wearing. Sandy says, you are very talented. I love your beautiful sweaters. Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you. All right, so I think I'll keep going. All right, so now we're going to get back on chronological track. Oh. Kathy says, if they used bicycle spokes, when did larger knitting needles start? So the idea to use bicycle spokes, that's pretty recent. That's more about this time in history. So like the mid 1800s was when people first started using bicycle spokes to knit. The very early knitting projects, like if we're talking about like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, were using more like a wire. Like they were very, very fine, very, very thin needles. It's hard because there's a theory that there may have been wooden needles pretty early on, because we do see thicker knits, like with thicker, heavier yarn. So obviously they had to have been using thicker needles. But if they're wood, they didn't really survive to modern day because wood disintegrates, it rots. So they may have been using wood. We don't have a lot of examples of thicker like steel or other kinds of metals like iron. We don't really have a lot of examples of those. So we suspect that they may be using wood, but can't confirm it. It's just sort of a lucky guess. All right. So by the industrial era, knitting starts for the first time in history to be seen as a really genteel, like ladylike, delicate skill, rather than something that all men and all women do pretty much equally in order to make things that we need to survive. This is kind of the first time in history where you think of like a lady knitting lace. This is kind of a new idea. Jenny June, who I quoted at the opening of the program, she said that knitting helps ward off the, quote, ennui. Examples from this era show a trend towards small and decorative projects such as socks, lace trim, baby items, purses, slippers, that kind of thing. This is also the first time in history that printed knitting patterns or receipts, like a receipt that you would get from the grocery store, as they were called at the time, they first start to appear with regularity in books and newspapers and magazines and pamphlets. However, these early knitting patterns are not easily readable by modern knitters. During these early days, there were no standards for yarn weights or needle sizes or garment sizing like we're used to today. A modern knitter would trust today that no matter who the author, a K is going to stand for knit, whereas P is going to stand for purl. There was no such consistency in these early days of knitting patterns. For example, a purl might be called a purl like we know it today. It could be called a purl, P-E-A-R-L. A purl stitch might also be called a seam stitch, a rib stitch, a back stitch, or a turn stitch. Some patterns even use these terms willy-nilly. Decreases might be called intakes or narrowing, and they wouldn't specify whether that was a knit two together or a slip knit. Gauge, or how many stitches something needed to be worked in the inch, which completely dictates the finished size of the final object, were rarely, if ever, included in this era. Some books did include very basic instructions on how to knit, such as how to cast on or bind off or decrease, etc. So you weren't left entirely on your own. But most of the time you were left pretty much on your own. Some knitting patterns came with illustrations rather than the photographs we're used to seeing in pattern books today. That technology was just simply too prohibitively expensive in this era. So sometimes we may have a little drawing, sometimes we may have a little written description. Many times we have nothing at all other than the title. One of my favorite examples, though, of a knitting book from this era, which was published in 1838, contains actual miniature little examples of the finished object. We can see here that this pattern is for a sock. On the left-hand page, it kind of looks like a spreadsheet. The rows are for what size the sock is going to be. So it says like first size, second size, third size, like growing in sizes. And then the rows up there on the top, that is what part of the sock you're on. So for, first size, cast on this many stitches, first size, knit this many rows before the heel. So you basically use that spreadsheet to find out what to do. That is the entirety of the knitting pattern you see there on the left-hand page. And on the right-hand page is a little tiny itty bitty sock that is supposed to be what your finished object looks like, that somebody knit and stuck into the book. I think that is absolutely lovely and adorable, and I wish that more knitting pattern designers did that today. I think we need to bring that back, little teeny tiny knitted versions of the finished object. Jenny June, who I'm going to quote again, said that knitting patterns from the era usually, quote, descriptions and directions will usually leave one half at least to the imagination. I'd like to share with you also a knitting pattern from 1848. This is a pattern called a night stocking, and it's from a book called A Winter Gift for Ladies, Instructions in Knitting, Netting, and Crochet Work, written by an American lady. That was the pseudonym that the author used. This is the entirety of the pattern. So get ready, get your pens out. Ready? 4 needles required, 54 stitches on large pins, turning every other stitch and lessening a little gradually towards the end. That is the entirety of the pattern. There is no other detail. I have left nothing out. To kind of translate, that means that it's worked on 4 double pointed needles of a slightly larger size than usual. So probably like a 5 or a 6 today in American sizes. You're going to cast on 54 stitches, and turning every other stitch means to purl every other stitch. So it's a knit 1, purl 1, and then lessening gradually towards the end means to knit 2 together for the toe, like doing decreases for the toe. So that's the whole pattern. By the 1910s, knitting was no longer relegated just to smaller things like socks and little knickknacks. For the first time in history, sporty casual sweaters became very popular and very trendy, and something you really wanted people to see you in. So we can see here on this cover, this is the celebrity dancer Irene Castle from a knitting pattern book in 1917. Irene was sort of the Ginger Rogers of her day. She was most famous for helping to mainstream jazz and ragtime music in Europe. But Chicagoland residents will probably know her other work as the founder of the animal shelter Orphans of the Storm. Around this time, I think it's pretty safe to say that many people were learning to knit from books and from pamphlets rather than just being taught how to do it by another person. This is because knitting books start to contain significantly more detail than they had in previous years. Including the gauge starts to become a lot more frequent. We start to see the final measurements of the items. There's even more descriptions of the yarn to use, like whether it's a soft yarn or a fluffy yarn or rough yarn and how many plies it probably has. We also start to see more photographs rather than just illustrations, or more likely nothing. And some of these photos are even colorized either with paints or with colored pencils in order to suggest trendy color palettes. Patterns in this era are really a goldmine for research because now things are completely explained rather than leaving the modern reader to just try to fill in the gaps on their own. While personal knitting wasn't entirely abandoned, knitting for the war effort during World War I became paramount for any man, woman, or child back home. At this time, rationing of yarn for civilian use was requested, but it was not mandatory. Knitters were choosing to work for the war effort by making what was nicknamed comforts, such as scarves, vests, hats, or bandages. And yes, people were knitting bandages, which were then donated to the Red Cross and sent up for use on the front lines without proper sterilization. This photo here depicts a knit-a-thon, their words, not mine, it was a knit-a-thon, that took place in Central Park in 1918. Of all the comforts a person could make, socks were considered to be of the utmost importance. It is estimated that 1.3 million pairs of socks were knitted by everyday American citizens alone for the war effort. Why socks of all things? Well, most soldiers were typically wearing 2 pairs of socks at a time, especially when they were in the trenches. In taking, for example, the boots that American soldiers were issued in 1916, they were technically waterproof, but they were so rigid that they would really easily tear apart from the sole and the upper just through the natural flexing of the wearer's foot. Tearing open those shoes meant that water was going to get in. Water getting in your shoes mean your feet get wet, means you get gangrene, means you get other horrible infections, which could lead to amputation and even death. By the end of the war, American soldiers were issued a less rigid boot that was less likely to rip open, but they were still so uncomfortable to wear. And I have tried on reproduction World War I era boots. They're incredibly uncomfortable. And every step you take just sends shocks through your knees, through your ankles, through your back. So people were wearing 2 pairs of socks at a time to kind of function as a sort of makeshift insole to just sort of comfort the bottom of their shoes or the bottom of their feet inside their shoes a little bit. So they were wearing 2 pairs of socks at a time. In an era before nylon, socks would get worn out, wet, damaged incredibly fast. So back home, Americans were just churning out socks after socks after socks in order to donate to the Red Cross to issue to the soldiers. So the reason why people were also knitting socks rather than having people like industries make socks on the machine was that hand knitting was producing a much higher quality of socks that at the time machine knitting could not replicate. So at the time, machine knit socks were basically tubes that the companies would cut a little gap in and then sew in a heel and then sew the toe closed. But having that sewn heel and sewn toe would create a lump, which again could rub on your foot, create a blister, lead to gangrene, lead to amputation, lead to death. Hand knit socks was the only way to get perfectly smooth heels and perfectly smooth toes. And actually the first government official to call for the knitting of socks was Lord Kitchener. He was the British Minister of War, and he called for the women of England to start knitting socks the very first day that war was declared. And he already was emphasizing seamless heels, seamless toes. He emphasized that so much, he didn't appear to know the name of that technique, just that it could be done. At the time, they would call that grafting. You may still hear it being called grafting today. But we actually now call that technique after him. We call it the Kitchener stitch after Lord Kitchener because of his constant repeated over and over again message that it must always be seamless heel and seamless toe. So if you ever wondered why it's called the Kitchener stitch, it's named after Lord Kitchener during World War I to make the seamless toes. After the war ended, the new men and women of the Jazz Age embraced hand knit sweaters as comfortable, casual sportswear. Knitting also became part of high fashion, with designers like Coco Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli making elaborate and unusual designs, including sweaters with kinds of optical illusions of buttons and bows knitted in. One of the things that really strikes me from this era is just how contemporary and comfortable the designs look. Judging by the published patterns, we see a lot of sweaters and vests, a few sporty stocking patterns for men and women, as well as some beaded bags and necklaces. Rayon, which at the time was known as artificial silk, also starts to appear in many patterns as a luxurious alternative to the more costly silk yarns. 1930s knitting patterns are really quite lovely. A lot of them are very artistic and use a lot of design and elements and techniques that I don't really see before or after. There's a lot of puff sleeves, there's a lot of colorful embroidery, draping, bias, and fancy lace stitches and frills galore. These patterns were trying to emulate the styles of Hollywood movie stars and the trends in high fashion, which show the need for glamour and for self-expression. Of course, we can't ignore that this decade was also the decade of the Great Depression, when many families lost their income, or at least a significant portion of their income, and had to rely on knitting to make do or mend. Many instruction books at the time cheerfully describe how to save money on materials or how to update tired articles of clothing with new ribbons or new collars or new scarves. The first circular knitting needles appear at this time, which used to just be 2 pointed needles joined by a metal cord. Metal needles, metal cord. I actually have a pair of circular knitting needles from this era. They're terrible. They are so stiff, and there's such a big disconnect between where the needle and the cord joins that it just snags your yarn, gets all tangled up. They're absolutely terrible. So while I have seen a few knitting patterns from this era that do call specifically for the use of circular knitting needles, it would take a few more decades before they were used commonly. Knitting was again really important during World War II. For civilians, rationing was very strict, and that required people to learn how to be creative with their clothing. For example, there was a ban on the use of silks for garments, as silk was needed to make a parachutes. New yarn required rationing coupons to purchase, so many people turned to unraveling and reusing old knitting garments. For example, in England, a person would receive 66 clothing coupons per year, and they would have to turn over a certain number of coupons with every purchase of clothing. One coupon would buy you 2 ounces of yarn. To illustrate just how little this is, if I were to knit myself a simple fitted cardigan in fingering eight wool, I would need about 14 ounces of yarn. That's 7 of my 66 annual clothing coupons right there. I may still need to buy a new coat. I may still need to buy new shoes, new underwear, new socks, and all of those would have to hand over coupons every time. And once you're out of coupons, there's no more new clothing for the year. So there's a lot of emphasis on patterns that use very, very small amounts of yarn, or that use leftovers and basically are like scrappy projects. So that way you don't have to buy any new materials in order to have a new garment. I have an example here, and in the spirit of the thing, I used all leftovers from other projects as well. Here is a 1940s pattern that calls for just using your leftovers. So these are all leftover scrap bits of yarn. You can see there's 3 different shades of yellow in there. I didn't have enough of any one of them to go all the way through. But you can get a whole new sweater out of just saving up your leftovers without having to purchase anything new. So there's a lot of stripe designs, a lot of Fair Isle designs, a lot of color blocked designs even. That way you could just take those little balls of yarn and add them all up to something really great. And again, not have to use your clothing coupons for them. Knitting for the war effort was not as commonplace during World War II as it had been during World War I. It was still very much a part of wartime culture, and a lot of film stars were still photographed knitting their bit, and there was a couple of songs celebrating cheerful, tireless knitters. However, machine knitted socks were now much higher in quality with fewer bumps and a much more natural heel turn, so it was no longer quite as necessary for hand knitters to fill the gap. Then also rationing was just so strict that it was hard to get your hands on any kind of yarn, let alone enough to start just churning out endless pairs of socks over and over. Knitting was definitely still needed, though, for the morale boost and for the symbol of love and care it offered in an inconceivably difficult time. One excellent representation of this comes from Christina Chiger's green sweater, which was made by her grandmother. We can see it here on the slide. Christina's mother knit her the sweater in 1941, and she brought it with her in 1943 when her family hid from the Nazis in the sewers under her hometown. When they eventually escaped and moved to the United States, Christina titled her memoir after this green sweater, and it now resides in the United States Holocaust History Museum. Knitting in the post-World War II era was much more focused on enjoyment and self-fulfillment. Many instruction books at the time emphasized how learning to knit can be just fun, so much fun. Children can make their own toys. You could make your dog a cute sweater. As you can see here, this mother and daughter are just absolutely losing their minds in this advertisement because their knitting needle has the ruler painted on them and they don't need their tape measure anymore. We also see things like the Patton's knitting book with TV designs. You can see that little logo on the left, ideal for TV knitting. That came from a book that was designed to be patterns that you could knit very quickly and very easily while watching a TV program. So they're simple designs with kind of chunky yarn. So really that just shows you how much more of a leisure activity knitting was versus World War II, where you're saving up every little oddment and bit of yarn to add together to make a sweater. We also see a marked increase in the amount of artificial yarns, such as nylon and orlon. Circular knitting needle technology also improves significantly during this decade, and the all-metal knitting needles of the 1930s were quickly replaced by the much more flexible all-nylon knitting needles. And I do have a pair of all-nylon knitting needles. They're just like modern knitting needles. You almost wouldn't even know that they were from decades ago. They're just as good as today's knitting needles. I like to call this time period the dark ages of knitting. This is because knitting loses a lot of its popularity and a lot of its widespread interest during the 1970s through the 1990s. During this time period, mass-produced clothing just becomes a lot cheaper. The pace of life starts to increase. So to spend hours making a garment seems very not cool during this time period. This is where a lot of the jokes about like knitting is for old ladies come from. At the same time, though, we do see the rise of the concept of a celebrity knitter, which is a knitting pattern designer whose designs are just so recognizable and so iconic that they're almost like a fashion brand. We have people like Elizabeth Zimmerman in her book, Knitting Without Tears, who really made some very iconic and very influential, not only knitting patterns, but ways that we choose to knit. So, for example, Elizabeth Zimmerman was the first person to say that it's nicer to knit with a circular knitting needle, even when you're knitting flat. Like you don't have to just save your circular knitting needles for knitting in the round. They're great all the time. And then we also have people like Barbara Walker, who kind of one of her iconic statements that she always made was that knitted sweaters were from the top down. Knitting top down sweaters seems to have always existed, but it wasn't always the most common choice. For a lot of history, it was bottom up and seamed. She really liked the idea of top down and seamless, which makes knitting go a lot faster and is a lot easier to fit as well. And of course, just like everybody else, crafters hit the early internet in search of other crafters, supplies, and patterns. This list of abbreviations I took from a book that is especially for stitchers on how to find craft-related Usenet groups, or how to use email to get in touch with other hobbyists, or how to find websites that offer free patterns. This is a little aside that they have on how to use abbreviations related to knitting and to crafting in order to seem really hip and cool on the internet. Some of these I think we need to bring back. Others I don't understand at all. One that I can't say I could ever really see myself using is SEX, which is supposed to stand for a Stash Enrichment Expedition, as well as Foreplay, which is supposed to stand for our really exciting projects, let's add yarn. But I do think we need to bring back Toad, which they said should stand for Trashed Object Abandoned in Disgust. In the early years of the 21st century, we see a huge uptick in interest in knitting again. One real game changer is the advent of Ravelry in 2007. Ravelry is the social media site for knitters and crocheters and currently boasts 8 million members. The book series Stitch and Bitch also did a great deal to make knitting young and fun again by providing instructions in casual language and a selection of really trendy, cool patterns. Once again, like our pre-industrial era ancestors, knitting could be a social event, and the writers of Stitch and Bitch encouraged people to make knit nights and to find kindred spirits and come together and knit in public places. With the rise of the internet and social media, the idea of a celebrity pattern designer really took off, and designers like Stephen West and Andrea Mowry are just incredibly iconic these days. Here's my take on one of these very popular knitting designs. This is one of Stephen West's patterns. It's the Exploration Station, and it's a really beautiful pattern. I do love his designs. So you can see it's got that kind of sort of like wedge shape that's kind of like almost looks like it's like rocking back and forth across the shawl. And then there's like a brioche section and a little lace section. I really love this pattern. I have worn it to public places where there were other knitters there, and it did scare my husband a couple of times because people walked up to me and said, "Oh, is that an exploration station?" And he was like, "How would they know what pattern you use? How could they know that?" And I had to explain, well, some patterns are really popular and lots of people make them, so they know what they look like. And he was like, even with different colors, they know what it looks like. I think he thinks I'm in a knitting cult. It's just really popular. It's a popular design. Now here in the 2010s, knitting really has once again hit the mainstream and is once again cool. For example, the pussy hats, which are seen here in a 2017 Women's March, were all hand knit and designed to be used as a unifying symbol for a single political movement. According to Ravelry, nearly 13,000 hats were knit from the original pattern alone, to say nothing of the many spin-off patterns. The slow fashion movement has also grown in popularity in the recent years, which encourages practitioners to make their own clothing, either by knitting, by sewing, by thrifting, in order to turn away from the waste of fast fashion, which churns out clothing quickly at great environmental cost and pays very poor wages for workers. Many celebrities today knit, with actresses like Kristen Ritter of Breaking Bad, the Bee in Apartment 23, and Jessica Jones, who publishes her own knitting patterns, models for Yarn Company, and encourages her followers on Instagram and Facebook to also take up knitting as well. Here in the early days of the 2020s, during the pandemic, a lot of people have picked up knitting. I don't know about you guys, but I think everybody I know, maybe 75% of people I know, reached out to me during the pandemic because they wanted to learn how to knit and wanted resources on how to go about that and where they should start. It's also been a great way to connect with people by sharing those sorts of patterns and experiences. Knitting is actually very popular on websites like TikTok. A lot of teenagers think it's really cool to knit and really want to learn how to do it. I don't see knitting going away anytime soon. I am so thrilled, honestly, to see it become popular again. I can't wait to see where knitting goes next, honestly. So if you want to get in touch with me, my email is knittinghistorian@gmail.com. My Ravelry is Bewitching Woolens. I've also appeared on the Fiber Nation podcast and the Pessimist Archive, which is now known as Build for Tomorrow, Build for Tomorrow's podcast. I will pop my link tree into the chat here so you guys can see. I've got links to everything there. Let me just meant to have that saved. There we go. So there, that is a link to anything else that you'd want to know. You can see links to the projects that I've been part on and other ways to contact me and all that good stuff. So that's all I have for today. If anybody has any questions, I can hang around for a little while and answer them. Kathy says, so interesting. Thank you. Thank you for coming, Kathy. Thank you. Yes, Pamela, go ahead. If you unmute yourself, you should be able to. If you unmute yourself, Pamela, you should be able to ask a question. Otherwise, you can type it into the chat or to the Q&A.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button.
Oh, you're okay. Did you want to ask a question? Or are you okay?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. That's okay. All right, and then Chris says, I don't see your entries in the chat. The link tree here, I can put that in again. So that's like a link to like various places that basically my other appearances. They're all in the link tree linked there. Sandy says, I'm a crocheter. Knitting intimidates me, but you make it very interesting. Thank you. I'm glad. Crochet is a fascinating history in its own. I have been asked to do something similar for crochet. I'm in grad school right now, so I don't think that's going to happen, but maybe someday. And Julie says, thank you. I need a project now. Yes, definitely. Chris says, I'm on mobile. Maybe that's why I have your email. That'll do. Thank you. Yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I love helping people with research projects. If you want any of my sources, if you want to know how to start researching knitting history on your own, there are basically very, very few texts on knitting. You basically have to go around and assemble all of these different primary sources. So it can be really intimidating to start. So I'm happy to help people see where I get my information from. So yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Sandy says, would love a crochet presentation when time permits. Okay, I'll add it to my list. It's someday, but yeah, I'm in grad school right now. And then Kathy says, so glad younger people are interested in knitting. Me too. I learned to knit very, very young, and it makes me really happy to see other people too. No pressure. Thank you, Sandy.
All right, and with that, I think we can wrap things up. Liz, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your amazing projects.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you at home for joining us today. You can find a recording of this on our YouTube page. Thank you for joining us tonight, Liz. Anything else you'd like to say?
Nope. Yeah.
Okay.
Just thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming, and thank you at home for being here. We'll see you next time. Have a good night.